Hello and welcome once again to The Blueprint. This is Canada's Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Schmale, Member of Parliament for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, with new content even throughout the summer, every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to this program. Tell your friends to download it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. You name it, it is out there. On today's show, the world needs more Canadian oil and gas, but do the Liberals have a plan to get it there? To talk about this and much, much more, we bring on the one and only Shannon Stubbs, the Member of Parliament for Lakeland, also the critic for natural resources. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks for having me. And I have no idea how you just said all of that at one time.
It was pure luck. You know, we can't do it again.
It's almost like you're expert. You've done it a few times.
Once or twice. Canadian oil and gas, you represent a province that has a lot of it. Unfortunately, there are some obstacles getting it there. Let's talk about the obstacles the federal government's putting in front of it, okay? This is absolutely insane. You and I worked together on the natural resources file for a few years, and since 2015, when we were both elected, we were calling for more of energy from Alberta, getting out to Tidewater. But the Liberals have stopped that and had a few other plans of their own.
Yes. Well, aren't we in a topsy-turvy world, having gotten elected together in 2015 and have been fighting the entire time against the Liberals every step of the way after they brought in one bill, one policy, and gave one message after another for year after year after year for the lost anti-development Liberal decade. That was about keeping resources in the ground, about telling the world there's no business case for LNG. They were clearly the only people in the world who thought that. And
how many world leaders came?
Yes, exactly. Dozens of our allies, dozens who, for clear geopolitical security reasons that are also important to North America and to Canada, wanted Canadian LNG. And it is exactly because the Liberals turned them away and stalled, delayed, and killed dozens of LNG proposals that were on the table when they took office in 2015. That they let Canada fall behind. And in that same time period, the United States became the world's top LNG exporter. Mexico raced ahead of us. And our allies have been forced to sign deals with, countries like Qatar that hide Hamas and obviously don't have anywhere near the environmental safety standard, governance, or environmental, labor, safety, or governance standards that Canada has. And of course, in so many of those countries, unlike Canada, where the responsible development of all natural resources, and specifically oil and gas, benefits every single Canadian across the country because it delivers billions of dollars of tax revenue to all three levels of government to provide those programs and services that all Canadians value. That's not what happens in other countries where there's authoritarian development of oil and gas, where the benefits go to a wealthy few. None of those countries, of course, self-impose any of these anti-development laws, policies, and taxes on them the way the Liberals have inflicted on Canada.
Well, just because you mentioned that, I just want to remind people and kind of paint this picture because this gets left out of a lot of the conversations. For the most part, when the Nord Stream pipeline was completed and Germany started buying their energy from Russia, that fueled and paid for the war in Ukraine. It was only after the fact the German Chancellor came to Canada, kicked to the curb by Justin Trudeau, and as you mentioned, signed a multi-billion-dollar deal for Qatar's energy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, why do we not create the jobs, the opportunity, the wealth right here?
I think that's what Canadians have been asking for 10 years. And unfortunately, I think now, because of external threats that Canada faces, because of geopolitical shifts, because of all of these growing conflicts and instability, Canadians know for sure, without a doubt now, that Canadian energy self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and security also means Canadian food, job, and national security. And what is, I think, really rewarding to see, of course, is that the latest data shows a supermajority of Canadians support pipelines and support responsible energy development in Canada for Canadians by Canadians. 79% of Canadians overall say they want pipelines. Over 80% of Quebecers say they want pipelines from Western Canada instead of being stuck with foreign oil. That, of course, has been the case over the last decade as well, but those Liberals would never admit it, right? Because it went against their own narrative.
But I find it no discomfort, no personal discomfort for all the Liberals who were there during the Trudeau years. Many of them are still on the front bench, and voted for barriers to access to development.
Yes.
Every single time.
Totally.
And now they're on team, let's get something done.
Yeah, it's wild. And of course, and this isn't just you and I making claims. The reality is half of the cabinet is the same. They're the exact same people. And you're right. It has been mind-boggling to watch people who we have faced for the last 10 years, who we have been saying, the world wants more Canada, the world needs more Canada, Canada should be the supplier of choice of energy and of technology to help lower global emissions, strengthen our relationships with our allies, be self-sufficient, united, and secure. And it's been those guys who are proponents of the keep it in the ground, leave half of oil reserves in the ground, and put forward Bill C-69 that all the provinces and territories opposed, that Indigenous leaders, the private sector opposed or said had to be totally overhauled. And then the Supreme Court said the exact same thing. These Liberals left it. They're the ones that unilaterally brought in the shipping ban so that Canada couldn't export with a direct line to the safest deep water and most direct access route to hungry Asian markets whose oil demand is projected to continue to grow by 40% by 2040 and want Canadian energy. And these are the exact same Liberals that brought in Canada's industrial carbon tax and are jacking up that price to punish Canadian workers and businesses, while neither the US nor any of the OPEC countries, nor China, nor Russia, none of those countries have federal industrial carbon taxes because they know that it would be bad for their economies and bad for their people. These are the same Liberals that voted for that. Well, actually, they didn't vote. They did what they always do, which is they were in a different country where they declared they would impose a Canadian oil and gas cap.
That's a good point.
And they celebrated that it was the first kind it was the first of its kind in the world. Meanwhile, here you and I were back in Ottawa doing our jobs in Canada for Canadians in December 2023 when they made this announcement outside of the country. And what we as Conservatives pointed out at the time was the fact that this is the first one in the world is not a point of celebration. It's actually a cause for caution because the reason is that none of these other countries are self-inflicting this harm that the Liberals have self-inflicted on Canada. So, and there is there is more after that. Of course, there are unilateral drilling bans and anti-development zones in water and in land that can happen at the stroke of a pen, and more than $600 billion in major projects that have fled Canada precisely because of this liberal anti-development, anti-energy agenda. And yes, like you, I mean, it's one thing for the new Liberal MPs to come in here and say these things, and I guess we could take them at their word. But to see these guys who we have fought and have fought against us to block Canadian resources, kill Canadian jobs, and phase out Canadian energy, which they said they did because they also admired the basic dictatorship of China, like 3 months ago.
Yeah.
Standing up
ago,
now
right?
and plagiarizing the things that Prime Minister Stephen Harper set out as a vision for Canada and that we Conservatives for the past decade have been fighting for nonstop against them every step of the way. And it is wild. No wonder Canadians lose confidence in politicians and in government, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And these Liberals seem to forget that these pipelines are not built in a day. They get shut down in a day. Absolutely.
But big time.
When government bureaucrats and politicians start to pick and choose and let Northern Gateway, which would have brought Alberta energy to the, as you mentioned, hungry Asian markets that are looking for ethical energy. And of course, Energies, which have brought Alberta oil to the refineries in New Brunswick and stopping the tankers coming in from Saudi Arabia, which is pretty remarkable in today's day and age that we have to import anything. And Trudeau Liberals barely said anything when Joe Biden stopped the Keystone XL expansion through the United States. So every step of the way, the Liberals have been throwing hurdles at this industry.
Yes, you're right. That's been their actions, and we should judge them on their actions, not their empty words and rhetoric.
And they all clapped together when it happened.
Big time.
They're still there.
Yeah.
Right? Like
yes, and
this is not the new government.
Yes, that's right. And what a travesty for our country. And also it flies in the face of all their own rhetoric, which they're still spinning now. So, of course, as you know, that Western pipeline to BC's coast to export Canadian oil and gas to Asian markets was one that 31 First Nations had spent years negotiating with its private sector proponent to get that pipeline built in a good way and to seek jobs, environmental oversight, and own source revenue for self-sufficiency. And then the Prime Minister Trudeau, backed and advised by Prime Minister Carney, who says half of oil reserves should stay in the ground. That's what he says.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's been his position his entire
he shuts down
career.
Canada's development, but invests elsewhere.
Oh yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, you're right. He showed with his businesses, isn't that right? While he was counseling the Prime Minister to keep Canadian oil and gas in the ground, he spent money in building pipelines to the U.S. and overseas, which of course is exactly what the Liberal agenda does for Canada, though.
Right.
It takes us out of the global market and it cedes that market share to competitors around the world who are nowhere near the world-class energy and responsible resource producers that Canada is.
So let's cue up cut one. So the one pipeline we do have somewhat in construction, or actually working, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because the government had to buy it off the private sector proponent who was going to pull the plug on it because the regulations, the rules, and the red tape was so onerous they just couldn't see a light to the end of the tunnel. And of course, your buddy, and I say that with all due sarcasm, and everyone's buddy in the energy sector, Stephen Guilbeault, was asked about, are we on a path to get something done? Play cut one.
Are you against the construction of pipelines in Canada? What I'm saying is that we already have an infrastructure in place that's not even at 50% capacity. So before we think about building new infrastructure, we should maximize the use of what already exists. And as I said to your colleague, the Canadian Energy Agency and the International Energy Agency... Yes, but the Prime Minister is saying, well, let's build pipelines, and you're pushing the brake on that. Well, what I'm saying is that the International and Canadian energy agencies are saying that demand for oil will peak by 2028, 2029, and there's no developer who's interested in building an east-west pipeline at this time.
Okay, I don't know what he's talking about.
We almost need to go point by point
right?
by point.
There was so much there.
Yes.
You want to unpack
Where
it for us? Unpack
do we
that.
start?
Well, if the private sector wants to risk their own capital, they clearly see an opportunity.
Yeah, very good point, Jamie. And actually, it's instructive, isn't it? Because he keeps using the words, we are building the pipeline, we. They mean government.
Yeah,
and the
that's
consequences of their agenda after the last 10 years is to have killed the private sector, created actually oligopolies out of their bad policy agenda, but then at the same time force out proponents and entrepreneurs who want to build energy projects and then justify subsidizing them.
Exactly.
Because, of course, that's what they're actually all about, a command and control agenda and they admit it because they say they want to restructure Canada's economy and they believe politicians are the ones who should make that determination. But even his comments about this existing pipeline being 50% full, it's just not true. It just isn't. Actually, 80% of the Trans Mountain expansion is under long-term contracts from its producers and shippers, and 20% flexibility in the pipeline is actually completely normal and favored often by shippers, so that there's flexibility and capacity. So he doesn't know what he's talking about. And again, they spin this like peak oil thing, except we should actually just look at reality, which is that as developing countries continue to industrialize and as the biggest and fastest growing economies continue to grow in the world, none of those other countries are shutting down any kinds of resource development. And all of those countries will continue to demand energy long into the future, and including, of course, chief among those, many strategic partner countries in Asia who Canada should be racing to make partnerships with 100%. To be the world's energy supplier. But that's another thing. Like, what low ambitions and aspirations for our country does this guy have? Because even if his claims about peak oil were true, wouldn't it still be the case that if you're a federal member of parliament for our country, you would want our country to be the last supplier?
That's a fair point.
Like,
while displacing the bad actors.
Right.
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
Yes, so if you really care about lowering global emissions, because they're because emissions don't follow borders. And so therefore, responsibly produced Canadian oil and gas that is constantly innovating to continually to reduce emissions can be exported. And then that helps global emissions lower because it will displace higher emitting sources of energy and fuel and power in other parts of the world. He is this guy is this very exactly this sort of virtue signaling guy who's out in this fantasy land. And so, he says on one hand, he cares about Indigenous reconciliation, but he's the first guy to say no to the growing Indigenous people and communities who want more ownership, more partnership, more equity deals in responsible resource development, which again, in Alberta and in Saskatchewan and in BC and in other parts of the country, but especially in Alberta, Indigenous people have been driving energy development for decades.
Well, he just means more government programs to help keep people addicted to government, right? Not out, charting their own course, which I think everyone wants.
Yes.
I think that seems to be the goal. But here, you hear the Prime Minister often talk about, we need consensus on these projects. Well, you get 10 people in the room together. Like, I don't think 10 people are going to agree on everything.
Yeah, I mean, don't we even hardly ever agree what to have for Easter or Thanksgiving or Christmas supper? Yeah.
Yeah, and they want to involve different provinces and groups and stakeholders. So Albertans here are looking for clarity on Carney's energy policy. Flip to the second graphic here, and there we go. So now consensus ends at the British Columbia border, potentially.
So the big question is, even if they somehow do get consensus, maybe that will happen, even if they somehow do get consensus among premiers to build various pipelines in all directions, which is what Canada actually needs, what happens if there's obstruction and attempts to block the building afterwards, which these Liberals failed because they didn't enforce federal jurisdiction? It seems to me, to your point, if you're saying you need full consensus from all the premiers, it's clear that's already not happening. Then Canadians should ask these guys, well, what are you going to do this time, since you believe in one Canada, to actually enforce federal jurisdiction to make sure proponents can build their projects? Jamie, I mean, you and I as Conservatives, we respect provincial jurisdiction. We believe in local decision-making. We believe that local governments know best what their individual provinces and people need, because that's the great thing about our diverse country with 13 different provinces and territories, all kinds of diversity among the people. That's why one-size-fits-all top-down governance really doesn't work for a country like ours. But this is where Canadians can be forgiven for asking what the heck consensus actually means to these guys and whether or not they are going to enforce federal jurisdiction. I think back to that veto of the Northern Gateway Pipeline and, those 31 or more even First Nations communities who had billions of dollars worth of mutual benefit agreements with the private sector proponent. The court did rule that there was a failure in Indigenous consultation, but also said the government could redo the consultation in as little as 4 months, get that done right. Now, that was the choice that Justin Trudeau had once he became Prime Minister. And instead of consulting all of those First Nations while he, had his hand in his heart and had his hide a tattoo and all those things, he, instead of consulting with them, instead of redoing the Indigenous consultation and getting it right, did an outright unilateral authoritarian veto and killed the entire thing. Well, then fast forward, they also risked the Trans Mountain expansion proposal, which predated them coming into government, because they forced the review to happen all again. And then the court said that they, the Liberals, failed in their Indigenous consultation on the Trans Mountain expansion. Now, our point at the time was, if they had done it and gotten it properly, if they'd done it in the first place and got it right, for that first dedicated export pipeline to the West to Asia, then they would have front-ended that. There would have been no delays on TMX. But they got that wrong. They did their delayed, and then they got it right. So there is a successful process to follow now for pipelines. But then They gave the approval, and then what happened to the private sector proponent trying to build the Trans Mountain expansion at that time? Well, the provincial government weaponized their laws, the municipal government weaponized their bylaws, numerous activists exercised their right of protest and freedom of expression, but refused to follow the pretty generous court injunctions that just said things like, stay 500 meters away from the entrances and exits for your own safety. The Liberals did nothing, while really roadblock after roadblock, blockade after blockade was put against the private sector proponent. These federal Liberals had tools in their toolbox to enforce federal jurisdiction. We conservatives called on them to do that, including asking them 4 different times for unanimous consent to declare the Trans Mountain expansion in the general advantage of Canada, which would once and for all confirm the constitutional fact that interprovincial pipelines are in federal jurisdiction. The Liberals did not do that. That is why the private sector proponent was finally forced to abandon that project, because they just couldn't see their way to getting through to the end. Then we know the rest of the story. These guys bought it, delayed it, took it forever. It's $34 billion and counting, costing taxpayers, behind operations, and mostly, of course, just goes to the Gulf. So Canadians can be forgiven for asking, well, what will happen now? These guys now are talking about one Canada, the one economy. They're going to now get major projects built, even though the same cabinet ministers also announced that a couple of years ago and they didn't get anything done. And they're saying, they want these major nation building projects. Well, now they need to answer Canadians then, but what will you do even if you do get to give the approval within this 2-year timeline they're promising? And then activists and other levels of government and all these groups exercise their legal rights to challenge their approvals. What will the federal government do? What does federal jurisdiction mean then? Will they actually enforce it when their actual track record is to stand on the side and let these projects get killed because their actual agenda is to keep Canadian resources in the ground?
And even their language before it, when they're talking about we will decide, we being the cabinet or the Liberal Party, will decide which projects are in the national interest. So now, to me, that means that anybody who is a small startup or whatever, they're cooked. There's no way they can afford to make, hire the right lobbyists and the right lawyers and donate enough money to the Liberal Party so that they at least get a conversation with the minister or something to pitch their case. And hopefully, if the light shines upon you, you get approved on your project, not on its merits or anything like that. It's basically how close can you be to government.
Yeah, and people might be, hearing us have this conversation and think, oh, we're being partisan, except that that's exactly the Liberal track record, right?
Absolutely,
$64 million in tax dollars to their buddies that they can't find and won't go back. Maybe that's even up to $100 million. Scandal after scandal after scandal.
Slush funds.
Yes, exactly. So I think that is a real concern. But what really strikes me is that they're not fixing the fundamental issues in the first place. They have brought in C5, which admits that all of their own laws that they've brought in for the last 10 years blocked anything from getting built. Otherwise, why would they need this C5? Right. But to your point, there isn't really concrete clarity and details around these various broad national interest factors that almost everybody could agree with or disagree with, depending on your perspective on any project whatsoever, which again, as you've pointed out, the ministers themselves will decide. And so I think, too, Canadians can be forgiven for saying, well, why don't you start at the place where there already are dozens of real projects and real proponents sitting stuck in the Liberals' own regulatory mess in front of the regulators that the Liberals created? And some of these projects have been there since they started, since 2019. They're all sitting there. They're real projects, real proponents, real people in nuclear, in uranium, in oil and gas, in LNG, in infrastructure to be able to unlock the Ring of Fire. Yes, in all kinds of different kinds of mining. There are dozens of projects sitting in front of the federal regulator, stuck in the Liberals' regulatory mess right now. Why wouldn't they start there?
That's a great question. And so I don't think we actually answered the question, do the Liberals have a plan? I don't think they do, but we went way over time. But it was a good discussion. I'm not discounting that at all. We did go a little over time, but as you know, the guests always get the last word. Shannon Stubbs, the floor is yours.
Well, Jamie Schmale, I forgot that part.
I'm sorry. Surprise.
Well, what would you like my last words to be?
Whatever you wish to talk about.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Canadians should hold these liberals to account for all their big promises and all their big rhetoric. They are the same Liberal Party, and half the ministers are the same, but they're talking a big new game. And we, as Conservatives, we will we'll continue to do our duty as the official opposition, both to oppose the government and also to propose solutions as we are, because we do want to see big projects get built for Canadians by Canadians using Canadian materials to ensure Canadian unity, self-reliance, and security. But we are the only party that has been consistent and unequivocal about that for day one, over and over and over, and for the last decade. So these Liberals say they've got this plan to get big major projects built in 2 years, and the countdown starts, doesn't it? And I guess we'll have to check back in 2027 if shovels are actually in the ground and Canadians are actually building these projects that these very same Liberals have stopped and blocked for the last 10 years. Are you a betting man?
For the country, I would like to hope so.
Yes,
reality,
it's imperative for the country.
In reality, I'm very skeptical just based on everything you just laid out, the Liberals' track record the last 10 years. So, for the country, my goodness. Shannon Stubbs, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
Member of Parliament for Lakeland, also the critic for natural resources. It was an information-packed episode for you today. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share it, because I guarantee you're not getting this message anywhere else, and that was so much information. It's a wealth of knowledge, so tell your friends to listen to it on platforms like CastBox, iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. You name it, it is out there. New content for you every single Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Even throughout the summer, the hardcore summer, we continue this information. Until next week, remember, low taxes, less government, more freedom. That's the blue.